Demos. These days, they seem like the vestiges of a bygone era. They were useful marketing tools when the internet was only a nascent entity. Now, though, every game is preceded by carefully pruned hype articles, and their release heralded by countless Let's Plays hitting YouTube and Twitch. In many respects, it's more difficult to not know about a game than to have the entire thing played out in front of you. In such an era, what possible purpose could a demo serve? Or a better question, what can you do with them if you stop viewing them only as ways to advertise a game? In 2014, Kojima and the rest of his team would release PT under the guise of a fake company to push those boundaries and would, in the process, redefine the entire horror genre. This would inspire no shortage of imitators and competitors, none more notable than Resident Evil. I've heard those words time and again, but so infrequently heard them elaborated upon, so let us do just that. Let's find out just what PT was and how Resident Evil, however briefly, entirely reshaped itself in the mold of what would never be Silent Hill. From the moment PT opens, it drowns the player with an atmosphere of confusion and unease. It is still astonishing to this day to see the environment so know it was originally rendered on a PS4. The house you walk out into it perfectly evokes a domestic setting that's just a little wrong. Everything here feels perfectly uncanny. The radio host talks in a parlance just a little too sinister. And how do you get onto that second floor landing anyways? Those family photos seem nice, if oddly out of date. Why is there so much chocolate scattered around? Everything seems here to be both domestic and foreign, put together by people who see only a culture from the outside. Not unlike what we will see later with things like, Clancy Javis. These questions and many more just send wave after wave of dread wafting over you right until your first encounter with the truly unknowable. I've become pretty inured to horror media over time, but walking down the dark hallway after the specter of Lisa stood there only moments ago, I feel as though there is an invisible hand on my chest pushing me back, a voice in my mind begging me to go anywhere else. Nothing could be worth proceeding through that dark abyss. While it has no doubt been remarked upon many times, this game's death leaves me immeasurably sad. Not only for PT's more sensationalized elements, but merely for the masterful digital craftsmanship being showcased here. Really, honestly, it's hard to think of better horror games than this. Even though PT is light on narrative elements, what is here showcases some of the themes that I feel would be later more haphazardly integrated into Death Stranding. The father in PT seems heavily influenced by subliminal codes in the media to kill his family. A dark but more thematically reasonable way of exploring the influences of media, both traditional and social, in our lives than the cargo-crazed mules would later go on to be. It's really hard to view the mules as anything but a joke. However, here in PT we have a more personal lens to explore the way that people interact with media and see the consequences of it in their lives, even if that is through a supernatural lens. What we got were Facebook junkies on withdrawals. I think I'll take the sink fetus over that any day. Perhaps it is the brevity of PT that makes it so much more a success in my eyes at communicating its ideas than Death Stranding. It's entirely possible that a whole game of Silent Hills full of emails and monologues about how the media is corrupting people into brainless flesh monsters wouldn't have landed as well. We'll never really know. Spoilers for PT, sorry. Its title means playable teaser. You know, for Silent Hills, that game that never got made by some Kajumbo or something. That's honestly about it for PT. You wander through some masterfully crafted horror vignettes for 30-ish minutes, and then you get stuck in a dark hallway that loops infinitely forever. Weird that. Oh well, on to Resident Evil 7. That is at least the experience that a fair number of people on release had with this demo. But so much of it hints at something more. What are all those little pieces of paper? Why did the game seemingly break and show a strange error message that it was definitely not an error message? What was it that bag? PT was designed from the ground up not only as a small horror demo, but a crowdsourced escape room, and this meshes perfectly with its horror themes. Even if you know the solution to PT's final puzzle, it still feels like you're doing some sort of forbidden ritual, summoning a dark entity from beyond the veil. The use of meta elements here is also excellent at enhancing the horror. The first time I heard the ambiance of Lisa's final appearance, I thought it was actually the game breaking. It just adds this element where you can't tell if the game's fucking with you or not. The distortions are so effective and subtle, it's really easy to dismiss it as the game malfunctioning. The point of all of this is that PT inspired a fever in its player base. As soon as it became apparent that PT had a solution, the race began to... someone called Suppy Warpig solved it on the first day. There was no race. Saying they solved it, though, is a little bit of an overstatement. People would go on to attempt to recreate the solution themselves to mixed result until there was an actual defined solution. You take 10 steps in any direction after midnight, say Jareth after the first ghost appearance, and then stand still. If you still believe that, you're one of the many people still misinformed by the original community to this day. You see, the Jareth method has been categorically disproven. Yes, the 10 steps and standing still thing are correct, but you only need to say anything into your microphone for that particular solution to work. The mystique of this game is so powerful that 7 years later, people still believe you need to say Jareth repeatedly into a microphone to solve this game. For that matter, the second step is still debated on and not fully understood to this day. Guides still list multiple methods of getting that second baby to laugh. It's a baby laugh. The second step is a baby laugh. I'm pretty sure the only thing that could really ever answer our questions about the game would be a statement from the people who worked on it, and they aren't talking. Here I am, still getting caught up in the hype train of a game that I know will never happen. So just try to imagine being part of solving this and believing there was a whole game behind this. PT was a PR masterpiece, and more than that, inspired a whole generation of horror fans and games. Silent Hills, despite lighting the entire goddamn industry on fire, was destined not only to flicker out, but aggressively be stomped down into nothing. Indeed, we know how this story ends. Kojima left Konami after the release of Metal Gear Solid 5, and Silent Hills was not only cancelled, but PT was removed from the PlayStation Store entirely. Even playing PT now is a pain in the ass. Your only options are to buy one of the PS4s with PT still on it, or do what I did and play Unreal PT. It's not as detailed or pretty as the original, but at least this one tells you how to solve it in the manual, and you can play it in VR. Natively with motion controls, it's pretty amazing. I really recommend it if you have a VR headset. To this day, it's still hard to fully understand this decision, as both Kojima and Konami have been very tight-lipped as to the reasons for his departure or the cancellation of Silent Hills. We're only left to speculate on why this particular golden goose was killed, but the answer is quite likely mundane. Konami, you see, has been infected with the same virus perpetrating the games industry. The mold! And it's not the mold, it's not RE7. It's a categorical aversion to any game without an infinite earnings potential. Even if Silent Hills had been made and garnered, $300 or $400 million, as RE7 would go on to do, it still wouldn't be as much earnings potential as a game made for $10 that produced $100 million off of its microtransactions. The cancer in the games industry is a topic that merits much more coverage than this critique, so we'll suffice it to say that monetary reasons resulted in Konami deciding to kill their cash cow and move on to pachinko games. Goddamn it, pachinko games. So here we are. PT is dead. Its hype, however, is still very alive and destined to go somewhere. PT was released in 2014, and by March of 2015, Silent Hills was officially dead. The outrage was immense. Truly, Silent Hills promised to be a horror dream made in the most nightmarish hellscape. People were left only to weep and wonder where it all went so wrong. And maybe wonder more so what the legacy of this landmark title in horror would be. Would anyone pick up its torch? Those wondering would have to wait a while to see what would come of the influences of PT, as next year at E3, Resident Evil 7, along with its also originally named Resident Evil 7 teaser, would be revealed. This demo would shortly be made available to players to experience both in VR and standard versions. What people found was PT all over again. Or was it? You awake, again, alone and disoriented. Immediately, the most obvious comparison to PT stands out as the jaw-dropping dedication to visual fidelity. Even 4 years on, the textures still look remarkably lifelike. The not-so-mundane domicile, adorned with trinkets, furniture, and decorations, all meant to stand up to the close scrutiny afforded by a player in VR. The house creaks and lists in the wind. To say an exorbitant amount of effort went into making sure this house in the bayou felt as real as possible is an understatement. I cannot blame the developers for making such a robust demo in a location that has so little screen time in the main game, when such love and care was put into every broken shelf and upturned piece of furniture. I revel in this swampy hollow, and despite its absolutely disgusting nature, I'm only so happy to spend more time here. Make no mistake, however, everything here is meant to scare. After wandering around a bit, you will come to the original demo's main attraction, the Sewer Gators tape. On this tape is recorded the fate of a man with my favorite definitely real American name, Clancy Javis. Oh yeah, baby. The first few minutes set the tone of this and clearly show just a few of Resident Evil 7's influences, with the host of Sewer Gators being a cynically motivated skeptic right out of Grave Encounters. And if it wasn't enough that we are inexplicably watching this on a VHS tape in 2017, the game wants to make it crystal clear that they're also doing the Blair Witch, if the weird stick dolls earlier didn't enunciate that enough. The whole sequence ends with a shot-for-shot remake of the ending of the Blair Witch, only with less tact and subtlety. I would be remiss if I said this absolutely hacky scene stealing didn't work. Games are often able to get away with just doing a thing a film or book has done because the experiential perspective of a game makes it feel novel again, even if the barrier between influence and execution are as thin as cellophane, which they definitely are here. What works less for me is the clear attempts to ape PT, with most notably the ghost appearing throughout the Sewer Gators footage, which seems quite tailored to resemble Lisa. I do love that the end of the Sewer Gators tape shows you that your tool of egress was right in front of you from the very beginning. It's just one of many masterful moments RE7 will go on to engineer. Now though, only a lever pull and a quick walk to the door stand between you and...
Welcome to the family, son.
If you followed the track of the original demo and wanted to unwind its secrets, you would no doubt be one of many welcome to the family over and over and over again, all in the pursuit of something that never existed. Don't get me wrong, the original Resident Evil 7 demo had secrets, the most obvious of which prodded the player very naturally after finishing the demo for the first time. What happens if I hit that switch before playing the video? It's worth noting that the interact trigger for the switch only appears after pressing towards it for a few seconds, making it difficult to trigger on accident. This so clearly and cleverly incentivizes playing the game in the way the developers intended without forcing you to. Hitting the switch first leads to a thing that leads to a switch that leads to an attic that leads to something else purpose-lifted from PT, a phone. Cryptic messages would play on this, prompting many to believe it was Ada Wong, and that this was the grand connection to Resident Evil. This never materialized into anything, but nonetheless, all of this inspired a similar fervor to that created by PT. Many of the items in the game hinted at something more. What were those headphones for? What was the dummy finger in that drawer for? The answer was... nothing. They all led to nothing. For all the pretense of some big crowdsourced escape room like that of PT, nothing came of it. Even the developer comments at the time hinted to there being something more. There wasn't. Interestingly, this seems to have been driven most by some comments from YouTuber Jesse Cox in his talk with some of the developers, who said at the time that there were 4 to 5 different endings to the demo. Were I to guess, this maybe seems like a miscommunication that there would eventually be 4 endings? This didn't stop some from believing and trying for quite some time to solve this demo with no solution. Capcom did, however, eventually confirm there's nothing more to see here. The first demo update made this even clearer, containing the voice line, "All doors are meant to be open, otherwise they wouldn't be doors. But some doors are meant to stay shut, for now." All of this cryptic talk of doors seems again deliberately evocative of PT, but this time the message was obvious. There's nothing more to see. Until, of course, the final patch. That leads us to the final demo still available today. Finally, we did have that big PT-style puzzle meant to be crowdsourced and solved by a big community. The entirety of the guest house was open, and all of its secrets too. Despite the original subterfuge, people were only too happy to jump back into the RET. A mix of brute force and redditing would solve the game's final puzzle, the 5 murders. The dummy finger finally found a hand, and you needed to point it at the site of 5 murders indicated by lines in a journal added in the first patch. This wasn't all, however. To advance the first 4 clues, you also needed to take an esoteric action after pointing to the first 4 murders. As a way of explaining, the first murder clue reads, "Grace will not wake when the clock makes its chime. Her covers are heavy, and it's her last bedtime." To solve this, you need to point the finger at a fallen shelving unit on the first floor. Then, and this is the fun part, prompted by absolutely nothing, look at the light on the second floor. But only after getting the VHS tape. Maybe? Just like PT, RE7 evokes much the same feeling of doing some arcane ritual. And just like that game, while the solution in broad is known, guides to this day list dissimilar information on how exactly to solve these puzzles. Also, after solving each murder, a child's laugh is heard. I hate to beat this drum, but again, not unlike PT. Regardless, solving all these puzzles will grant you the amusing message, "You are the best ever," and an item transferable to the main game. Not exactly what I expected for a ghost summoning ritual, but alright. Somewhat amusingly, this isn't even an ending per se. The actual ending to the demo comes by going to the basement and facing an enemy for the first time, which does finally prompt 2 new endings. One for if you're damaged by the molded, and one if you aren't. If hit and infected, you face a fate very much like that when Jack welcomes you to the family. But now, he has only disappointment for your failure. What a poor son you turned out to be. Reach victory uninfected, however, and you're greeted with a very curious ending, where Clancy escapes only for his story to be dismissed when LSD is found on his person? If this confuses you, you're not alone. Were to make a guess, this is probably a sort of joke ending, not unlike something like the dog ending from Silent Hill 2, although a bit more muted than that. I do fully approve of this, however, as in a gritty horror game, how could a happy ending ever be anything but a joke? No matter how much time you spent in the guest manor, it's over now. Every stone has been upturned, and while you no doubt still have numerous questions, such as, what was with those mannequins? Who was that ghost? Who was on the phone? And how is any of this Resident Evil? The answer is that many of these questions only ever existed to generate speculation and make people wonder, to evoke the air of PT. While I don't mind a red herring or two, the fact that so many of these elements existed when every clue led nowhere does make it clear that it only existed to evoke the aesthetic of mystery without any real riddles to solve. This is further reinforced as many elements from the demo will be entirely pruned from the real game. Even though these mechanics contributed to people talking about this demo for months after its release, it does feel ever so slightly cheap to know that in retrospect, this is nothing but a kind of cheap marketing gimmick. So here we are. It's 2017 and Resident Evil 7 is finally here. We will finally have answers. We start with a false open, introducing us to the uncanny valley wife of the protagonist, Mia Winters. She gives the classic horror, stay away, acting as the harbinger trope, but only for the audience. This intro will come to seem more ridiculous as we get to its actual circumstances, but that isn't for a while. Jump cut to the real open of Ethan Winters, driving through some wildly well-rendered Louisiana swampland. This sequence absolutely popped in 2017, and while some higher rendering resolutions do see through a couple of the mirrors, the sequence remains absolutely stunning. What we drive up to, though, isn't just the answer to 2 years of questions, isn't just the Dulvey Mansion. It's one of the best horror sequences in gaming. It's worth taking time to soak in every detail of this opening. We are finally treated to a proper view of the Dulvey mansion. Its classical Victorian architecture harkens to a time when money must have flown through this place like wine. Now, like the swamps around it, the homestead has grown stagnant, infected. Cast your eyes left and see the first deadly steps of our intrepid sewer gators. They have even left us a message to join them. Our next sight in this little theater of horror will be only too familiar to those who have traveled this far on the journey. Jack Baker perfectly disappearing outside of our frame of vision. Ethan's movement is slightly slowed here to make sure we cannot see behind the curtain, but it feels believable that he might hesitate upon having his isolation disturbed in this place. After a brief encounter, our vision is naturally drawn to a murder of crows congregating on some sort of meat. Our attention, expertly captured, any turn back to the intended path will reveal the wheel of cattle. The dedication that must have gone into perfectly crafting this moment, where game maker and player come together, dynamically weaving the minutiae of player attention and action for this dastardly reveal. It boggles the mind and truly shows one of the most perfect small moments of game design I have yet seen. But it will only be followed by another moment of genius. Stumbling onto the remains of a pyre, we find Mia's driver's license covered in some sort of black material, which prompts you to look at your inventory for the first time. Doing so shows you why Ethan came here in the first place. An email from Mia, only reading, Baker Farm, come get me. The tension was already ratcheted when Mia's life was implied to be in danger from the fire, but now we have been made aware that something even more sinister is going on. Finally, we re-enter the place we have spent so much time pondering in, the Baker Guest House. You know what to do now. Go to the living room, pull the lever, and descend. At last, we have the chance to move deeper. I was elated the first time I had the chance to move past the place where the script of the teaser had stopped me so many times. It is this immensely freeing moment to take that first forbidden step into the unknown that truly marks the beginning of Resident Evil 7. After confirming the fate of one more of the sewer gauges, we reunite with Mia, who is acting odd. It isn't long before she's taken back, and we find ourselves alone again. It is now time to be treated to Resident Evil 7's mastery of sound design. I'll just let this play out for you. The pacing, the way each sound directs you where to go, even if you want to be anywhere else. That one moment of silence as you approach the fateful threshold. All of that combined with minimal illumination, just enough of Mia to make her appear as something inhuman. Perfection. This is, however, where Resident Evil starts to steadily bleed out the influences of PT. When Mia rises from the dead, we are given an axe and a grudge match with our possessed wife. Ethan is surprisingly guiltless at murdering the person he loves most. The moment of ambivalence, though, is not without point to the game's overall message. But it will be a long time before we circle back to that. Just keep it in mind for now. Ethan is told to leave via a mysterious phone call, and after one more person walking out of frame, is grabbed, and his hand is cut off with a fucking chainsaw. And if it wasn't enough, just to have you cut off with, again, I feel the need to emphasize, a chainsaw, you will spend the next minute staring at the bleeding stump to let you know, yes, in fact, your hand has been removed. Ethan is forced to put his wife down again, and this sequence really sets the tone for the rest of the game far better than the demo ever did, as this level of bombast and absurdity is in fact what you should expect from the rest of the game. Ethan, however, is not afforded a moment to mourn his dead wife, if he was ever going to, as he is welcomed to the family, possibly for the last time. The entire return to the site of the teaser is maybe the strongest bit of influence from PT, if it can be said that there is any influence at all, where the deliberate confusion and psychological elements are most pushed to the forefront. And given what we just covered, that's really saying something. Jordan Amaro, the level designer for the cancelled Silent Hills, also worked on Resident Evil 7's design and setting. In a quote from him, however, he refutes the claim that Resident Evil 7 was influenced by PT, saying he, quote, wasn't part of the core team of PT, and Silent Hills would have been quite different from Resident Evil 7 anyways. I believe this quote entirely, for as much as I've droned on about the ways that Resident Evil 7 aped PT, those are mostly influences left to the demo, which seem to have been quite deliberately similar to PT, and quite deliberately dissimilar to the bulk of Resident Evil 7 outside of what we've already covered. If anything, it takes pretty significant influences from Amnesia and Outlast. One needs to look no further than the next scene presented to see that this is all true. We open onto an absolutely delightful family dinner, providing us our first look at the grotesque menagerie that is the Bakers. It's hard to describe the entire thing as any less than utterly self-indulgent camp, especially when someone's arm gets cut off for funsies and the whole thing ends with villainous cliché number 27. Surely he can't get out of that chair. Oh, Zoe stippled her hand back on, if you're wondering how that got there. I love the little touch after this that the former victims of the Bakers have been put into the fridge as leftovers, with titles like April 25, Male 30s, Lean Gumbo. The fact that they even put dates on it so they know when the human dishes are expired shows the vestiges of humanity left in the monsters at the table. It's such a wonderful little world-building touch. All of this scene, and more broadly this part of the game, goes on to provide spectacular texture to the character of Jack. The idea of an unstoppable nemesis antagonist by this point in time was probably most lodged into people's minds by games like Amnesia and Outlast, notably gaining attention before this most recent run of survival horror revivals. While Resident Evil 7 borrowed many mechanics, ideas, and motifs from other films and games, this it most feels like it reclaims, and uses to elaborate why the survival part of horror is so vital to the pacing and tension of horror games in particular. Having tangible consumable resources for health and dealing damage, both of which can be used to survive and debilitate the unstoppable tyrant in these few scenes with Jack, feel both empowering and as though you're throwing vital resources needed for dispatching future foes to the four winds. Without these metered mechanics, so much pacing and tension would equally be scattered and lost. These scenes with the indomitable Jack are so filled with immense love and attention. That wall in the long hallway to the main door, Jack can decide to Kool-Aid his man right through it. This seems to be a very clever decision from the developers, as it actually benefits the player, allowing them a valuable second route through this narrow choke point after they've collected themselves from having the bejesus scared out of them. Secondly, if you should perish right at the goal of the first section attempting to unlock a drop hatch, instead of killing you, Jack will playfully cut off your right leg and then give you a free strong first aid med to put it back on. He is absolutely brutal, but this is his way of welcoming you to the family. We see this again in the first boss fight where he positively jovially chases us around the garage and takes us for a delightful ride around the place. Defeating Jack will prompt him to show us...
Do I have your attention, boy? You're about to see something wonderful. Oh, fuck!
Further still, an arcane locks from old Victorian castles being just how you get into the main foyer reminds you this is a Resident Evil game, if that wasn't clear already. But wait, there's more. Order now and you get 3 absolutely absurd locks to the price of 1. The Bull Lock, the Triple-Headed Cerberus Lock, and the Shadow Puzzle Lock all come in one neat package for $19.99, shipping not included. After solving these puzzles, it'll become clear that there's but one piece missing from their novelty locks. One dog's head. It should come as little surprise that the last key is in the darkest steps, guarded by, you guessed it, the still very alive Jack. But this time, it's serious. Welcome to the Chainsaw Grudge Match of the Century. You heard me right, folks. A chainsaw duel! If you were wondering when those little subtle psychological horror elements are going to come back, this should cinch it for you. They're dead now. Dead forever. Still possessed by an utterly incessant glee to the core of who he is, Jack does his best to curb your enthusiasm for hobbies like individuality and not being a mold person. But you have a chainsaw, so feel free to tell Dad to leave you alone. You make your own decisions. And besides that, he's just those pair of alive pants from that one Wallace and Gromit sketch now, so ha! With this encounter, the slow descent into camp has become an absolute freefall. It would be really easy to imagine this final conflict as a campy Bruce Campbell movie, and I really can't help but feel here the most intense tonal whiplash. Am I meant to feel weak and disempowered, or like a chainsaw-wielding badass? The next segment will not answer this question. The game from this point is a hell of a mountain to climb, attempting to rebuild the atmosphere so carefully constructed by the game's opening. Assuming you've saved it to this point, the Mia tape is the perfect tone setter for the new environment. The Mia tape is unsurprisingly recorded by Mia and puts us into her disempowered shoes. She assures us that everything she did was outside of her control and that it's all someone else's fault. This was recorded by her only a little while ago, and it chronicles her journey through the lantern-wielding Marguerite's lair. Just like the Clancy tape from long ago, we control Mia through this interactive found footage. As a found footage film junkie, I do quite appreciate these tapes for adding just that little bit of flavor to the game, however tired the found footage gimmick is to most people. These short tapes both contextualize flashbacks and nicely break up the pacing, reminding us, yes, there is horror in the survival horror game. What is here is one more cat and mouse game, and that also informs us that the flamethrower is a thing, and that Mia is still unsurprisingly in danger. Back in reality, Zoe is astonished we lived this long, and sends us on a quest to find a cure that's being held by Marguerite, she thinks. If it feels like I'm skimming over Zoe's character, it's because I am. It's also because she doesn't have one. But we'll get to Zoe when we get to the choice. Oh, don't you worry about that. We're going to talk about the choice. Marguerite isn't nearly as well characterized as Jack. I would have really liked 1 or 2 moments to define who she is and how she fits into the family dynamic, but she really gets shafted in comparison to her husband or her son. She's pretty much a giant evil bug lady who turns into, you guessed it, a giant evil bug. I do love her arm that comes out to grab her lantern the first time she transforms. It moves at the perfect inhuman creepy speed, kind of like that Mia scene. Even the boss fight with Marguerite is mostly unremarkable. The most interesting thing that she does is jump out of a window at you every once in a while, but she's just a bullet sponge that summons lots of ads. The end, pretty much. Now we can get on to the good bit, where we go into Evelyn's room. If you weren't sure what Resident Evil 7 was trying to be before, now you will be only more confused, as I feel compelled to welcome you to the game's best horror sequence, Evelyn's room. Evelyn is the geriatric that has made an appearance or two up till now, most prominently featured around the table at the dinner scene. Now we must venture into her room, as it contains the D-Series arm, apparently an ingredient of whatever cure Zoe intends to make. Continuing the theme of horror being ratcheted right back up after each inane boss fight, The second floor sequence begins with spoopy phantom piano music playing that stops abruptly as we near Evelyn's room. Darkness and rot engulf her place of living. The drawings of a child and cryptic notes litter the floor and surfaces. The game leaves us unmolested during our trip into madness that we might have time to appreciate every inch of Evie's work. A drawer with too many shoes, another with too many dolls. Something is wrong with her. And just when we are reliant on it most, our light fails us, only to hear...
Stay away.
A map in a dollhouse shows us the way to a secret chamber. If you were expecting the D-Series arm to be something other than a mummified, disembodied arm, you would be wrong. This is the moment where it all comes together. Everything in this scene up to now would be every bit at home in something like Layers of Fear. No real threats, nothing to scare you but your own imagination. Trying to leave this place with your bounty will turn all those imaginary boogeymen into the very real beasts hungry for fresh meat. This juxtaposition of the slow calm build to the very real threats levied against you is why Resident Evil 7 needed to be. So long at horror games basked in the cool shadow of walking simulator and puzzle games, unwilling to return to the survival mechanics of old. But Resident Evil said no. They have their place, and I am going to show you. And it did, masterfully. All of this is seen no clearer than here, in this moment, in this sequence, where the temperature is turned from warm to hot to absolutely boiling. The team at Capcom responsible for this are masters of their craft. This is Resident Evil's contribution to the PT formula, and the most novel take it has on the concepts presented within. But alas, our brief stint into the darkest depths of despair and fear are over. And if you've been following up till now, you know exactly what that means. It's time for the campy chicanery to resume once again. Time. It pains me to say it. Time for a molded zombie coliseum battle. What is technically our third VHS tape reveals what is in store for us up at Lucas's bachelor pad, and also lets us know what happened to our good friend and last living member of the Sewergators, Clancy Javis. Reminding us of how all this started, Mr. Javis has been trapped in an escape room. Of death! Not only is this section amusing for the novelty of itself, but it clearly shows us not how to beat the room, but how not to die from it. I love how so many of the things here are making it very clear what is about to happen to Clancy, but he's just incredibly dense and progresses through the room utterly unaware of his surroundings. I mean, the man puts a balloon full of nails into a helium pump. Surely he had to feel those in there. He literally watches an edifice of himself burn to solve a puzzle. This man is just incapable of putting two and two together, but he does manage to reach the end, where he is unsurprisingly burnt to a crisp. I really like this tape, not only because it's so campy and shows the fate of someone I personally spent so much time wondering about, and who has the best name ever, but because it shows you the solution to an upcoming puzzle. More importantly, it shows you how to survive the escape room. Jarvis is burnt alive because he has to pull a cork out of a barrel with gasoline in it, but now you know the puzzle's solution. You don't have to pull that cork, you can live. Of course, if you've already played the game, you know that nothing I just said is true. All of this is the perfect setup for what is at the core of Lucas's funhouse, and that is subversion.
Ethan. Hold on. I got some for you. Looky what I've got. You know what Zoe wants to do with this? She thinks this thing is special. No, Ethan. That ain't special. This right here is special. You see, Ethan? Not everybody wants to turn back the clock. What? What, Evelyn? I'm just trying to show him. I'm just trying to show him not everybody wants to go back to how things were. There's a stupid bitch. She doesn't understand that I don't want to go back to how things were before my father found y'all. Now everybody wants to turn back the clock.
The first thing you'll encounter after Lucas' little outburst is a crate. It's like many you've encountered before, laden with useful supplies, but this one holds a dangerous surprise. A couple of tripwires later, and we meet with Lucas at a locked door. Here he does what he loves most in life. Fuck with us. 0814, 0621, 0514. Somewhat amusingly, the correct code is an anagram of 0814. But as many of you who have tried this will know, entering the code before you have found it will do nothing. Lucas never said he runs a fair game. Back away from the door quickly now, because a quick and painful death awaits the slow. The next event awaiting your attendance is the much-hyped showdown with the Mold Men. It's Winters versus the Big Boy Duo. The fight of the century is even complete with rock music and audience applause for your victory. This is quite a difficult encounter. On Madhouse, the game's highest difficulty, a duo of fat molded can just stun-lock you to death. Defeating the duo will lead us right back to where we started, this time code in tow. And accepted by the lock, just to be clear. Lucas, however, will not allow us to progress to what we can clearly see is the escape room with any items on our person. I think this is a New Game Plus protection? Kind of interesting. Oblige the Mad Game Master and enter the room of certain death with confidence. You know what to do. Admit you're a loser, grab the wheel, light the candle, and voila, you've avoided Clancy's fatal mistake. Oh, wait, there's a bomb. This is the perfect culmination of the ideas behind the Lucas segment. Everything you experienced made you think you were ready for this moment, but the second that bomb fell from the ceiling, all of that bravado goes out the window. Just where the bomb should go, as it happens, because you have one advantage Clancy didn't have. There's a hole in the wall that you can throw the bomb back at your tormentor with. Do this and our fun times with Lucas are over. He has set up a live feed monitoring Mia and Zoe, and somewhat amusingly, when Zoe introduces herself, Ethan responds only with a, "Who are you?" Honestly, having been nothing but a plot device up till now, I'll say she deserves this. We're finally reunited with Mia and Zoe, and after presenting Zoe with the ingredients for this cure, she just makes it? Right here, in the second floor of a bait house? Who is this person? How did she turn a shriveled up hand and a funky statue into a cure? Right here with all the tools of her average MacGyver episode. She even gives us delivery syringes. Where did she have these things? If you're looking for a clear solution to this, you won't get one. In no small part because this is more or less the first and last moment of characterization that Zoe gets. That characterization being that she's MacGyver. Jack interrupts your treatment of Mia and Zoe to give you a Lost Planet boss fight. Despite the absurdity at play in this fight, it's pretty entertaining. Many of Jack's bright, glowing eye weak points are located on parts of his body legitimately difficult to hit. And just like in Lost Planet, those weak point zits are very satisfying to pop. No matter how good your dermatology is though, Jack just won't go down, and you're left with no choice but to cure him to kill him. This depletes one of the 2 cures Zoe was able to magically create. And this leads us to the choice. Now comes the obvious choice. Cure Zoe or Mia and take a boat with them out of here. This choice frustrates me primarily because there's only one correct answer. I don't feel that choices should be a test to guess what the developer wanted you to do, but actions should meaningfully divert the story in equally valid ways. And while to an extent you could say that's true here, I would definitely contest that. Let's explain what happens when you choose each option here. If you choose Mia, she is cured, and while she is temporarily recaptured by the source of the mold later, she ultimately survives and Zoe's left behind for her infection to advance. We won't learn what happens to Zoe until the DLC, which we'll get to. If you choose to save Zoe, she's almost immediately reinfected and meets with the exact same fate, essentially being shunted straight to the DLC anyways. Mia's teleported to where you go next, regardless of whether you took her on the boat, and it's like your decision never happened at all. Only this time Mia is compelled later to fight you to the death. Essentially, what you get to pick is the difference between a good and bad ending. Now, I have a suspicion that the overwhelming majority of players just gave the cure to Mia anyways, since it's the canonized ending, and it just makes sense seeing as she's the reason we're here in the first place, and Zoe has the personality of a cardboard cutout. What I'm really getting at is that there could be no decision at all. Ethan could save Mia in a cutscene, and we could all move on with our lives, and the game would be stronger for it. This isn't a game about decisions, and this should have just been cut if they weren't willing to lean into it more than that. Like it or not, Mia's here and Zoe's crystallized. And so we've arrived at the lore dump of Resident Evil 7. The boat we use to escape will be waylaid by Evelyn, who appears throughout the section as a child, the reason of which will be made clear soon. Ethan is taken by Evie, and only Mia is left with the chance to negotiate the wreckage of the huge tanker before her. Evie is now actively manifesting herself to accomplish her goal of expanding her family, and she wants her mother back. At this point, we can say that Resident Evil 7 really likes taking away your equipment to have you run from monsters again for a while, and that's exactly what you do here in the shoes of Mia. Amidst the flashbacks and monster juking, one of the documents you might stumble across is a crew manifest, again listing some very great American names like Gerald Waddell and James Chalmers. I just love this stuff. It's so great. Evelyn sits on the 3rd floor waiting to make sure her mommy remembers. So with one more VHS in the player, we finally get to learn how this whole thing started. And no, I don't mean PT. Apropos of Evie, Mia is entirely subsumed by the past, where she's able to remember that she was originally escorting Evelyn to get her out of the reach of some vague opposing organizations, and that if Evie ever got out of hand, she was to take her out. Try as we might, we know the flashback only ends one way: the ship destroyed and Evelyn free. One side note before that, however, we do see the origin of that fake-out opener here. Mia just records it on what is presumably her laptop, as we also see the first video file here as well, but then she just doesn't do anything with the video? She appears to make no effort to actually send it out. It just sits on the laptop. All I can think is this maybe is supposed to show her already deteriorating under Evelyn's control, but I don't think so. Would it have really been so much effort just to show her trying to send it and have a little no connection thing flash up? I don't think so, but I'll admit this complaint is a little nitpicky. With this sequence clear, what exists of the game's overall themes are as clear as they're gonna be, so let's harp on those for a minute. The conclusion of this flashback sees the shady corporate ship exploding and leaking its toxic cargo throughout the Louisiana Delta. There's an obvious comparison here to the 2010 BP oil spill, which was still being cleaned up 3 years later, and the full extent of ecological and human damage we will likely never be able to fully calculate. An anti-corporate message can easily be read through this, but the primary way that we see the impact is personal. Remember back to when I mentioned Clancy being remarkably nonchalant at axing his wife to death, and even how cold Mia seems in her warning? In retrospect, that seems less accidental, as their relationship is extremely strained, primarily due to Mia's blind adherence to her shady corporate overlords that obviously cared not at all for those under them. The explosion, then, is only the corporate ambivalence finally reaching a head, destroying not only the internal lives of everyone caught in its wake, but now they find their very external selves changing too. When people finally totally succumb to the influence, they turn into monsters those on the outside can no longer recognize. There is still hope for those like Mia, some part of themselves still alive through the corporate malaise, but for those like Jack who fall totally under their spell, even being cured is no different from a death sentence. They're hollow inside, no humanity left. It isn't exactly world-shattering stuff, essentially corporation bad, don't give your lives to them, but Resident Evil 7 is about something. The rest of the Mia segment is more or less the bog standard gameplay we've had up till now: find key items, kill zombies, this time on a boat. It's all solid stuff, but things really pick up when we get down to where Evelyn kidnapped Ethan. Returning to Ethan's perspective, we see into some sort of collective hive mind, wherein we have a chance to talk to Jack, who seems to have regained his humanity. Jack apologizes and clarifies that all this started after they found Evie in some kind of container near the crashed ship. All this confirms the family's corruption at the hand of corporate influences, and Evie is able to reach into Ethan's mind, and she tells Mia that Ethan doesn't love her, but she could make him. Now is Mia boss time if you made the wrong decision earlier, but even if you did cure her, Evelyn takes her back. Mia, either way, manages to give Ethan a catalyst for an Evelyn-killing weapon, and we move on to the game's climax. And wouldn't you know it, the next place we go is one of Lucas's secret labs. We just stumble on it. It's great. It turns out that Lucas was cured by the suits Mia was working for quite a while ago, and conveniently it seems that only his mind was freed without losing any of the regenerative properties of the mold. How that works, I have no idea, but the game is basically having a series of strokes at this point, so just let it be. Just don't worry about it. There are plenty of notes around the lab that overly explain all the horror and demystify everything. The reason Evie was a child when she started but appears to be an old lady now is rapid aging caused by the source of the mold. She has an obsession with family caused by being isolated from anyone she was developed and intuitively sees it as a way of blending in. Also, there just so happens to be a neurotoxin made to kill her right here. Great. We insert the vial from Mia, and if my eyes rolled any harder at the sheer contrivance and cliches here, they would do a full fucking 360 kickflip in my goddamn skull. The game's final and most brutal combat encounter comes after this, but the real show begins when we finally get back to where it all began. And this time I do kind of mean PT. Resident Evil 7 ends back at the guest house. Spectral Evelyn and Mia's haunt the halls, reminding us of all the good times we had here together. Reminding us of those halcyon days so long ago. Solving murders, playing with fuses and dummy fingers. It's hard to imagine how we even got here from there. Mostly because it turned out that the Resident Evil 7 had very little to do with this game, ultimately. Yeah, that's why it's hard to imagine. Never mind, I've had enough reminiscing. Time to give the old lady her pills and a little melty flesh syndrome for good measure. Turns out not to be enough, and the only one who could save us is the man who fetched a fucking boulder. Chris goddamn Redfield. He drops even more 11th hour Resident Evil references on us with the only weapon capable of killing the mold. The old Albert. Dispatch the embodiment of corporate menace and reunite with Mia. Roll credits. Before wrapping up my thoughts on the main body of Resident Evil 7, I'd like to talk about the madhouse difficulty. The observant among you may have noticed some oddities in the footage I used for Resident Evil 7, and that's because it was all recorded on Madhouse. I generally dislike multiple difficulties in games and find the changing of enemy health values, most difficult to multiple difficulties, insufficient to either escalate or interestingly de-escalate challenge. Rather, I feel difficulties ought to offer bespoke challenges, both because I feel those handmade adjustments are more sufficient for manipulating difficulty, but they offer more reasons to replay the game on those higher difficulties. Madhouse shuffles item locations, and not just a little. As you possibly saw, I never had or used the Raven key. That's because it's locked behind a 3-coin price right after the garage boss fight. This allows you to get the shotgun early, but might preclude you from getting powerful permanent upgrades, or getting the Magnum later. The use of separating fluid, almost entirely unused by me and likely basically everyone else in the base difficulty, is highly emphasized in Madhouse. One of the first sets of items you find is a round for the grenade launcher and separating fluid. The implication here is clear. You aren't getting the grenade launcher anytime soon, so use the goddamn separating fluid. The ways that Madhouse change things and prods the player to adapt to the new difficulty is really masterful. Resident Evil 7 was an amalgam of influences, taking parts of found footage, classic horror camp, and just the spice of the more subtle psychological elements from recent games like Outlast and Amnesia. In the end though, Resident Evil 7 showed itself to be Resident Evil to the core. Whatever else it stuck on itself and whatever mechanics it borrowed, it could not and would not shed itself of its roots. Now let's get into the real weird shit, the DLC. The first piece of DLC, the banned footage, was released 1 week after the base game for PlayStation 4 owners, and 4 weeks later for everyone else. Everything about the DLCs, from a staggered release on the PS4 and other platforms to the small nature of the installments, was meant to drip feed content throughout the year and keep people thinking about Resident Evil 7. FOMO is a powerful tool, and live services have shown us this time and again. So many will jump back into a game when some new skin, or in narrative-driven games, story content is available, and they will do it as fast as possible to keep that ever-present threat of the deadly spoilers at bay. Despite all that, I do think this schedule will ultimately work quite well in driving the people working on this content to create novel and replayable gameplay experiences under intense time restraints. Each of these bits of DLC plays with the Resident Evil 7 format, turning it into something else entirely. And I do love to see developers using established game engines and assets to playfully tinker with their baby. The first of these Resident Evil experiments was, as stated, released under the banned footage moniker, and was actually 2 new modes to play around with. Nightmare presents the player with a simple premise: survive the waves. You will have certainly seen modes like this in many games prior, but Resident Evil approaches the concept with a level of dedication that makes this worth experiencing. Clancy needs to live through 5 hours, and has numerous tools at his disposal to do so. Each of these hours takes about 5 minutes and begins with a brief phase where you have some time to craft unmolested by enemies. You have the opportunity to both craft items and place deployables, all while collecting resources from numerous scrap generators placed around the map. It's all very classic Horde mode stuff. Completing the game at various scores permanently unlocks new items, both in the environment and for Clancy to craft. While this mode isn't exactly what I would call innovative, it does highlight just how entertaining and satisfying Resident Evil 7's combat is. Its focus on headshots, well-timed blocks, and chunky explosions of enemy limbs does create a combat system that I had only too much fun enjoying, divorced from some of the more tense elements of the main story. While not the next DLC, I will go ahead and mention Jack's 55th birthday here, as it shares many similarities with this mode. Not a Horde mode per se, the outright comical 55th segment paints Jack up with a birthday hat and silly glasses, asking the player to cook food for him. While similar in many respects to a Horde mode, as it focuses primarily on the gameplay loop of get gun and shoot zombies, this time the purchasing aspect is eschewed in favor of giving you a set amount of ammo at the start and having you scavenge the rest. I like this a bit more for putting a greater emphasis on the loops you actually experience throughout the game, and I've always been enamored with the concept of combining things. Something about finding all sorts of hidden combinations of items engenders a genuine feeling of discovery, of puzzling out the unknown, even if that unknown is just the understanding that you can put cheese or sugar on a cake. Oh, did you forget this mode was about food? Yes, your goal is to find food and proper seasonings or toppings for them to feed Jack till he is satisfied. You begin with a timer always ticking down, but killing enemies, especially with some of the power-ups scattered throughout the levels, gives you additional time to wander and prep Jack's next dish. Similar to the Nightmare mode, each completion grants you new toys to play with. But this time, there's a more interesting balance with them, as each food item takes up inventory space, but so does each weapon and upgrade. You must choose carefully the right balance between prudence and greed to maximize level root efficiency. I loved this mode, despite my initial skepticisms. I found myself playing it for well after the period I would have needed to play to provide proper comment upon it. It was really entertaining just to go through these gameplay loops over and over again. Again, it really does speak to just how good the core gameplay loops of Resident Evil 7 are. Let us end our chicanery now and go on to Bedroom. With Bedroom, we return to the banned footage and uncover the next chronicle in the journey of Sir Clancy Jarvis. In easily the strongest of the forbidden tapes, Clancy finds himself restrained and in the clutches of, Marguerite. Would you like to guess what she intends to do with him? If you guessed exercise his character upon him, and by exercise her character, I mean use her one character trait, feed him, then yes, you were correct. I really don't understand how cooking and feeding people is supposed to be a character. And this isn't even the last time we'll see this be her only defining trait in the band footage alone. Capcom really thought they had gold with this food thing. No. Positivity. This one's good. It is. Trust me. For all the talking I've done about escape rooms, we finally get one. The first big ticket item in the band footage is exactly that. You must escape while keeping the room exactly as it is right now. It's a very cute little gimmick, executed exceptionally well. Each narrow window Marguerite affords you, you must leave your puny restraints and sally forth to solve the puzzle. Clancy has as much time as he needs until...
What was that noise?
something unexpected happens. At which point you must put everything back the way you found it and get back in bed. If I had one complaint about this, it's the broken drawer. You'll very naturally open it on your attempt, and it will lead you to dying, as there is no way to repair it and put it back in its proper place. This little landmine would very naturally seem like a part of solving the puzzle, and it does feel a bit capricious to solely have this here to gotcha the player. That one small grievance aside, there is so much here to love. The way the Marguerite fakes out the player, the constant sense of tension and dread, never knowing what action will call the deadly bug lady back to force feed you some more dead rats. Each action must be remembered so that it might be undone at the slightest provocation. This simple twist is absolutely brilliant at making the player put care into every single action they take, for a single misplaced portrait means death. All the while, you still need to solve a puzzle and escape. Brilliant. Of course, even an escape from Miss Baker hardly means that Clancy is safe. Framed as an experiment of Lucas's, 21 is what it says on the label. It's a game of blackjack, but since it's Lucas, it's a game of, you guessed it, blackjack to the death! Divided into 3 phases. The first sees Clancy betting his fingers against his opponent. This part's pretty easy, since you can easily math your way out of it, and the first few hands are stilted in your favor as your opponent plays to lose. Getting out with all your fingers is almost a given, and this phase acts more as a tutorial. Phase 2 is where things really begin, as it's when trump cards are introduced, allowing you to take rule-breaking actions, such as drawing the perfect card, drawing a specific card, putting the last card back that you just drew. Your opponent, Hoffman, dies at the end of the second stage, but just like in the main body of Resident Evil, Lucas's games prove to be entirely unfair. Placing screws and strings into Hoffman's body, Lucas puppeteers the man into one more round with Clancy. The last round plays out almost entirely straight until Lucas just decides to kill you, requiring a bit of creative card usage on the part of Clancy to survive. This, however, we know is still the end of Clancy. He might have won for now, but he isn't freed after this little game, just placed into the next and final game of death, which he will not survive. But we have already seen that game. This mode has some replayability, allowing you to gain access to new trump cards and further survival modes, but honestly, I wasn't drawn in by this one very much, and just wanted to move on to the last DLC in this particular quadrilogy, Sisters. The second big-ticket item in the van footage, Sisters, chronicles the first moments of the outbreak in the Baker home and allows you a tour of the main house before it is lost to infection and rot. Getting a brief moment to see the real family of Resident Evil 7 is worth the time spent here, even if the only thing Marguerite does is cook. Again. This also does canonize some odd things, like that the novelty locks and that shrine to America were always here. But it's fine. All hail the glorious and holy America. The house falls to Evelyn swiftly after you give her a fresh pair of clothes. Marguerite is the first to embrace her gift, moments later also infecting Jack. I have some qualms with how fast the infection spreads here, with them being infected in moments, all with seemingly little direct contact with Evelyn. However, Zoe will go on maintaining her humanity despite said infection for 5 years. Yeah. After witnessing the first infection, the rest of this play is a little bit like a demo. Run from Jack and then sneak from Marguerite. I like the use of Marguerite's lantern here to indicate her direction and vision in the dark environment. This sequence makes me think that something like this was intended for the main game, but never quite made it in, since the lantern has no real mechanical use by her outside of this encounter. Evading Marguerite will prompt her to fight off Evie one last time to deliver Zoe a key, with which she might escape in the car. You must evade Jack by going through the crawl space and will no doubt draw your attention to a lockpick that can be used on a nearby drawer, giving you a little broken bottle that allows you a one-time escape from your tormentor. Trying to leave will only result in Zoe being welcomed to the family, harkening back to the original Resident Evil trailer. The original trailer is the thing this most resembles, as to truly beat Daughters, a keen eye and another run are required. Much like how the demo made you aware of the switch you could pull from the beginning, Daughters showed you the lockpick, and there is more than one locked cabinet. Use it on the bathroom and you will find the first trigger to unlock a ladder in Lucas's room, but you also need a key code to his computer. This passcode is cleverly hidden in plain sight, as when Lucas is using the phone near the start of the sequence, he inputs exactly the code we need. Doing this will lead us to a clue about a red tool case, which contains a dog head that we need to escape into the yard and find Mia in the central trailer. This is a bit underwhelming, considering the amount of effort required to get here, as all Zoe finds is a vague note about a cure. I would have hoped for something more concrete that explains why she's able to MacGyver the cure later, but this is what we get. Infected. Our story here is over. I found this to be only essentially the original demo, but much weaker in most respects. Without it so much detail and hidden secrets, here the reveals are underwhelming, and I just don't find myself invested in the plight of Zoe. The DLC fails to fix many of the issues I had with her or Marguerite, missing the last opportunity to flesh out either, and if anything, making Zoe's plight feel all the more ridiculous, as she stayed in this place, both human and infected, for, again, I feel the need to emphasize, 5 years. I also dislike that the sequence decanonizes the sort of slow descent into madness that was implied by going through Evelyn's room in Marguerite's corner of the house. It made this 5-year thing make a lot more sense if they kind of slowly over the years became more crazy and eventually started killing people, and maybe Zoe didn't know about it for a while. But again, this decanonizes any chance of that really having been the case and puts the whole Evelyn sequence into a big question mark. Like, when did that happen? How did that happen? Why did that happen? Very little that makes sense after the Daughters DLC. The last small piece of DLC, Ethan Must Die, is an ultra-hard nightmare mode for masochists. And I say that as someone who found most of Resident Evil 7, even on Madhouse, relatively easy. You die in 1 or 2 hits from everything, and you have to trial and error your way through a deadly revamped version of the Baker Manor to find your way back out to Marguerite's lair and kill her. I didn't even really try all that much in this mode because of the aforementioned nightmarish difficulty. I do like that in a mode called Ethan Must Die, they really aren't pulling their punches. This is a mode that, unlike most games, isn't meant to be beaten by the vast majority of people playing. The difficulty is cranked up to such an absurd high, it's meant to just have most people try it a few times and bounce off of it. This really is a mode only made for the true diehards. And to you select few, I wish you good luck in your mad endeavor. Not a Hero was a pretty significant piece of DLC released for free simultaneously with its paid counterpart, The End of Zoe. While clearly intended to continue the Resident Evil 7 hype train to its final destination and prod people into buying The End of Zoe, Not a Hero delivers one hell of an entry into the Resident Evil 7 canon. Not a Hero sees you put into the boots of the badass of badasses, Chris Redfield. He's a man known for punching things, and this DLC will provide no shortage of things for the angry military man to punch. This could very easily be seen as Resident Evil 7's Lost Chapter, where Chris goes up against the only antagonizing member of the Baker family whose story is unresolved, Lucas Baker. I can't help but wonder if Lucas's story was intended to be resolved in the main plot but was cut for time, or if saving his conclusion for the future was always the plan. No matter what the plan was, we find Chris trapped in one final game of death. An explosive collar placed onto his, wrist, which would, blow up his head, who Lucas says. Resident Evil 7 has a really weird hand thing going on. Anyways, the rest of Chris's squad all get collars on their necks. On their necks. Which Lucas can use to kill them at any time. Why exactly he doesn't just kill Chris? Because gameplay has to happen, presumably. Look, we're really down the rabbit hole of camp at this point. I spent 2 hours feeding literal garbage to Jack, so this level of contrivance isn't forgiven at this point. But I mean, we're gonna keep going. There's more. We're gonna keep going, though. After going through the mine at the end of Resident Evil 7, we find ourselves in Lucas's true lair, the place where he did his most dastardly of experiments. What mode of gameplay are we playing with now, I hear you ask? Well, we're a very light Metroidvania. Every area is open from the start, but gated by different requirements for entry. One requires a strong filter and the other night vision, and as the game makes it clear, continuing will only result in death for the persistent. Progressing will also reveal the DLC's other new threat, Invincible Molded, which can be defeated later through some other means, expanding on that sort of Metroidvania feel. Reminded we are ostensibly here to save Chris's squad mates, we return to the last one to let him free, only for him to tell us this was a trap! Why didn't he just tell us that before we got in the trap? This game is just in full not giving a shit mode at this point. Oh, look, it's Mr. Saw. He's back. He cuts the guy's head off and free filter. Nice. Using the advanced filter will finally allow us to progress, gaining both the night vision goggles and the ramrod rounds, which we can use to kill the Invincible Molded. The quantity of these ramrod rounds is fairly limited, however, so their use must be carefully rationed. The night vision section puts the goggles to efficient dual use, not only as they do illuminate the area, but show thermal tripwires that were killing us here before. There are still more new enemies in this area. The fat molded here might have lost their limbs, however they are no less deadly, hurtling themselves at us in suicidal rage, exploding on contact. It's nice to see new enemies this late into the game. Everything in this area is a trap, by the way. The clown key is a trap. The down squad mate is a trap. And even if we do manage to save him, he does have an explosive collar on, so I'm not sure what Chris thought he was going to do here. And what's that? Oh no! Chris's bracelet collar has started the countdown of 10 minutes. Yeah. The other guy just blew up, but, why not? At this point, we're into Saturday morning cartoon logic, so sure, whatever. One boss fight with a giant molded later and some cryogenic liquid to the old hand. The bracelet collar has been safely removed from Chris's hand and is no longer in danger. Time to go show Lucas what we think of his little labyrinth. The clown key allows us access to the secret connection lab. It's implied Lucas did experiments on the molded here, and not just as some Joe Schmo, but as head researcher. What about Lucas that we have learned so far makes anyone think he's capable of running a lab of actual scientists? At best, Lucas is a MODOK-level B-lister who seems like he'd spend more time having the molded fight for fun than real research. Oh, wait, that's exactly what he did? No, that tracks. That makes sense. Catch Lucas mid-email attempting to find a buyer for his inane nonsense, and you will find a turret blocks your way to the final confrontation. Or does it? This last little nod to the subversive nature of Lucas's character before his downfall really highlights how many little moments he gets. It's a shame they didn't give Marguerite the same attention. Chris confronts Lucas, and there's an odd cut to a huge cyst appearing on the ceiling. The logic here makes no sense, but I don't think the game's even paying attention to what's going on now. It's a nice little detail in this fight, though, that Lucas' face in his final form mirrors the clown motif we've seen throughout this DLC, and the final boss fight here is pretty good. It has a nice little gimmick where Lucas releases spores in the environment, and you need to utilize oxygen tanks placed throughout the room to survive, bringing back the timed filter mechanic by overloading even the advanced filter. The rule-breaking escalation that Lucas brings is both nicely in line with his character, while also providing a bit of excitement and tension. After Lucas has been defeated, there's only one problem left to solve. The E-Virus is being uploaded to a shady third party, and Chris needs to find a way to shut down the surfers carefully. But he just whips the shotgun and solves this problem Chris style. I love how campy Chris comes across in this sequence. He really is Mr. Meathead. Chris would be more at home with the chunky meat people of Gears of War whose entire problem-solving solution involves punching and exploding things. But he's here. And the contrast with the gritty realism of Ethan only makes this character all that more absurd and fun. Speaking of absurd fun men of meat, let's get on to the final piece of Resident Evil 7, the end of Zoe. There is nothing that could have prepared me for the end of Zoe. Would you expect the very last bit of Resident Evil 7 content we would see to have Zoe turned into Final Fantasy Shiva? No? Would you expect to be put in the shoes of a backwood hillbilly with fists of steel? Also no. Too bad. That's what it is. That's the premise. Forget the camp zone. We've moved straight onto self-parody with this one. In terms of pacing, however, this is the perfect release valve of the ever-increasing tension of Resident Evil 7. We have up to this point experimented with these mechanics in just about every way except to beat them up. So why not? Fuck it, just punch the zombies. Use the things once viewed as potent and terrifying antagonists at a literal punching bag. And yes, you can hear it still alive in the bag. It feels all the pain. This DLC has got it all. It's got combos, it's got stealth, it's got gators, and it's got zombie stomping. Oh, don't you worry, Donnie, it's got zombie stomping. You're gonna stomp a helping heap of the zombies. Stomp their heads right off. In the shoes of Joe Baker, we will cure Zoe come hell or high water, and Joe will have to contend with Budget Nemesis on his path to the cure. And in keeping with the fuck-it nature of this DLC, you don't run from Budget Nemesis, you punch him, right in his goddamn face. Every moment with Joe is meant to empower and punch away all the fears you had up till now. Except for your confrontations with the true Kings of the Swamp, the Gators. The Gator segments provide a break in the pacing, slowing Joe down and forcing him to scavenge for spheres to lob into the ancient creature's scaly heads. It's never long, though, before you're back on track, punching down those moldy freaks right until you have a proper wrestling match with Budget Nemesis. Oh, and I do mean a wrestling. If you ever saw the mold and thought, I want to suplex those motherfuckers, well, your time is here. The only mistake Joe makes is pulling off Budget Nemesis' head and throwing it right back into the water. Despite having found a cure on one of the Umbrella soldiers, Budget Nemesis steals Zoe away. But Joe tracks him down to a church where it's revealed Budget Nemesis was Jack all along. That's right. You just can't keep a good Jack down, apparently. Caught unawares, Joe is drowned in a coffin, but a little dying won't stop old Joe. No, sir. Especially when he finds his own personal Excalibur, the advanced multi-purpose gauntlet.
What the hell is this? One of their fancy toys?
Ready for use. Charging.
If you thought this thing couldn't get any sillier, boy were you wrong. Sporting your Fallout Power Fist, there's only one thing left to do. Go show Jack the old what for. The boss fight with Jack is mostly unremarkable. If you made it this far, you know how important blocking is, so just punch him real good and block or avoid Jack's attacks. No real complications this time, but damn if every punch you land isn't incredibly satisfying. The whole fight ends with a little bit of symmetry to how this all started.
This is farewell from the family, brother.
We are the arbiters of our own fate now. We have reclaimed the Baker name and laid waste to the toxic influences of the Connection once and for all. Every plot thread is exhausted. There's truly nothing left for us at the Baker Manor, and if punching your way through the bayou didn't serve as the perfect send-off to Resident Evil 7, nothing ever will. In the end, I was surprised how little Resident Evil 7 had to do with PT. Despite the demo's obvious connection, it was much more aligned with the other horror games that came out between 6 and 7. While Resident Evil games declined, new games with fresh ideas for the horror genre awoke. And when Resident Evil returned with its 7th installment, it had much to owe to those games, including PT, because they had reinvigorated public interest in horror games again. It's easy to look back and think that horror was always a mainstay, but the reason Resident Evil pivoted to an action game in its 5th and 6th installments was companies believing horror just didn't sell. The gap in the market that games like Amnesia capitalized on showed that horror was as alive as ever, if not more so due to the advent of YouTube and Twitch. PT wasn't the only game that rebuilt horror in the 2010s, but its viral nature and resonant weirdness did make it possible for horror to go AAA once again. Resident Evil may have only imitated PT with its demo, but it would have likely remained dead, if not for the PT virus. Thanks for listening.